Waiting on you, Nick. Okay, our student government representatives are not here tonight. I understand this week they have a banquet. Actually, I think it's tomorrow, that banquet? Tomorrow is the senior banquet. Yeah, tomorrow's the senior banquet. Okay, we're suspending the planning session. I need a motion and a second.
Motion.
I'll second that. All in favor?
Aye.
All right, moving over to the audit committee meeting. All right, reconvening it. I need a motion and a second. I'll second that. All in favor? Okay. Oh, here. Right up. Sorry, Jill, I was looking for you.
That's okay. Good evening. It's really difficult to follow up those presentations that were made with an audit committee report, but I will try, okay? So I'm here to talk to the Board of Education about the planning for this year's external audit. And I have some presentation materials that I distributed to you, so I'd like to just walk through them quickly if we could. Within the presentation materials, behind page, the table of contents on page 1, the team of individuals who are going to be responsible for assisting me are a person by the name of William Oderson. He's a CPA who has about 20 years worth of experience. Samantha Castano has about 12 years worth of experience. And then assisting Samantha will be another CPA. So the team that's in place is the same team as last year. I think understanding the school district entity is important, how Connecticut does things. School districts do things differently based upon staffing patterns. And so I think the continuity is good. Our objectives at the top of page 2, we have 4 primary objectives. We're going to express an opinion on the district's financial statements. We're going to give a report on the internal controls over financial reporting, compliance with laws and regulations. This is because the district has federal expenditures. It's under generally accepted government auditing standards. It's known as the Yellow Book audit. Also, because the district is very aggressive in trying to secure federal funding, you are over the threshold for having a single audit performed. The threshold is $750,000 this year. It went up from $500,000 the year before. Just as a reminder to the Board of Education, you get almost $2 million in funding for educational purposes and about $600,000 towards your school lunch program. And so there's new guidance that we need to follow, not only the Single Audit Act, there's something called OMB Uniform Guidance, which applies to single audits for this particular year. And also because the State Education Department tells the Board of Education that the external auditor needs to do this, we perform an audit on the extra classroom activity funds. And we know that these are not governed by the business office, rather they're governed by the central treasurers throughout the district who handle the monies for children. Information regarding the audit engagement. So we're supposed to give an opinion, and it's reasonable assurance rather than absolute assurance. The absolute assurance is in the form of what your internal claims auditor does with respect to transactions. Any immaterial errors or frauds, that's not really within the design of the external audit, but the Board of Education knows from the work that we perform, in the event that we come up with something in the course of our external audit, we do communicate it to the Board of Education under what's known as a management letter. And I'm very pleased, and I'm sure the board is pleased, that the level of comments in the management letter over the last number of years is fairly minimal. And I think your business office is really proactive in implementing procedures that address whatever we may comment on throughout the year. There are no, just as a reminder, there's different levels of internal control weaknesses. There are no material weaknesses. There are no significant deficiencies. And so these are higher level breaks in the internal control structure. And you might have heard about this from your internal auditor, but just as a reminder, you have a good internal control structure in place. That management letter is just additional procedures that we feel you may want to look at going forward. We look at transactions on a test basis from your total population because we need to make sure that we can give an opinion that the financial statements fairly present. We look at the internal control structure over the financial reporting. We're not the internal auditor. Your internal auditor does a risk assessment of your whole internal control structure, but nevertheless, I look at the checks and balances over cash disbursements, over payroll, over the way benefits are processed, over the way cash receipts and aid comes in. And I make a determination as to whether or not those controls are proper so that I can come to the conclusion of being able to opine on the fact that the financial statements with respect to those transactions are fairly stated. And then at the bottom of page 2, The district's responsible for preparing their financial statements, but we do assist the school district, and that is allowed. And we also assist with the preparation of the schedule of federal expenditures. So now on page 3, the district has an awful lot of responsibilities, and not to go through all of these, but the most important ones on this page, I'm going to go to the lower part of this document, is making all the financial records and related information available. We need to make sure we don't have a scope limitation on what we're performing. Giving us unrestricted access to district personnel. Why does that need to happen? Well, we need to inquire of the people that are involved in the various financial transactions for the district. What do you do? Why are you doing it? Are you having any problems with what you're doing? Do you see something that you're uncomfortable with? And those are all confidential interviews between my staff and your staff, the Board of Education staff throughout the school district. And we do that to make sure that we're looking at the possibility of whether or not there could be fraud, or whether or not there could be a misappropriation of an asset, could there be a misrepresentation in the financial information that comes to you, the Board of Education, throughout the year. So we've done this in the past, and we will do that again this year. At the conclusion of the audit, we ask for representations from the superintendent and the business official. Did you give us all the information that you needed to in order for us to be able to give an opinion on the financial statements? And then also we ask if we propose adjusting journal entries, which we had very few last year. Does the district record those adjusting journal entries? And we want to make sure that happens because the financial statements need to match up with the district's books and records after our audit is complete. And we do know that happens because when we come in to do our interim work, we make sure that all the numbers that are in your financial records, that are on your ST3, which is the document you submit to the state, agree with what our financial statement shows. On page 4, we have 3 standards that we have to follow. Generally accepted auditing standards, generally accepted government auditing standards, and the Single Audit Act and the uniform guidance. Any significant matters that I may come upon during the course of the audit, I feel it's my responsibility, if it's significant, to reach out to the board president at the time that that might come up. I've never had to do that in this district. I've had to do it in another district where it was really something that was high level. I don't feel it's appropriate for me to come back with the report and draft and then discuss something with the Board of Education then. So that I feel that that's my role, even though it's not published anywhere. Audit reports, we give you 3. An audit report on the financial statements, 1 on the extra classroom activity funds, and 1 on the federal single audit. 2 other written communications that we give to you. There's 1 in accordance with AUC 260, which means I tell you whether or not we encountered any difficulties when we perform the audit. We haven't had that in the past. What those adjusting journal entries are so that you get a comfort level that the financial information that you're looking at throughout the year is appropriate, and those adjustments do not necessarily materially affect that information, and whether or not the timetable had not been adhered to, or something was handled in a way that was contrary to the way that accounting pronouncements would expect it to be handled. And then if we have higher level internal control related matters, material weaknesses, significant deficiencies, I'm required to, under the standards AUC 265, communicate that to you in writing. And as the Board of Education is aware, you did not receive that communication in the year past or years past because there were no such items noted. And then I talked a little bit about the management letter. So these are some best practices that we might communicate to the Board of Education based upon the internal control structure that we reviewed. So on page 5, areas of audit emphasis. We're not the internal auditor, so we're not going to perform a risk assessment and then look at targeted areas in conjunction with what the Board of Education wants the internal auditor to look at. But I do need to look at the effectiveness and the design of the internal control structure. I need to make sure that it's appropriate, that it's working effectively, so that the financial transactions are appropriately captured, and that there's not a risk of material misstatement or misappropriation of assets or fraud. I look at management's corrective action plan. We remember that that's due to the Board of Education and the State Education Department. And that talks about, as a result of the management letter, what does the district feel is appropriate to put into place with respect to implementation of procedures to address what I might have commented on in the management letter. I'll look at your internal auditor reports and the findings. I can't rely on those in the design of my audit, but let's just say that the internal auditor, and I haven't looked at them yet because we haven't started the audit, came upon something that would impact the financial statement. Well, then I need to enhance my audit procedures to make sure that that does not materially affect the financial statement numbers. We look at significant account balances. It's typically payroll and benefits and cash disbursements. We looked at the restricted reserve activities. We look at it again, and that has to do with authorization for the use of monies in the reserves and then adds to the reserve accounts. We substantiate expenditures by function and program. How do we come to terms with, for example, we have numbers that are sitting in on the trial balance for BOCES. How do we support that? There's a contract that's signed, okay, with the district and BOCES. There may be some changes during the year which should be authorized also. We can actually look at those BOCES codes and say, okay, this is how much the district expended, this is what the contractual provision is, and I'm just giving you an example, and the numbers match up where they don't match up, and if they don't match up, what's wrong with the control structure? And that might be a management letter comment. We haven't had that in the past. Capital project expenditures, and so you have various things that are going on in the capital projects area of your budget. We know that that's in a separate fund and that's authorized by the community, and you've been spending that on a list of things that are necessary to preserve the facilities, and so we'll look to make sure that those are authorized and that the funding sources are in accordance with the propositions that were approved. The district uses an outside fixed asset inventory company, as all school districts do, to capture the information as to what their capital transactions are. And so we'll look at that additional information that's been added to that inventory. Does it agree with the equipment expenditures in the general fund budget? Does it include the capital project transactions? Is the charge for depreciation proper? If things have been disposed of in accordance with board authorization, are those items removed from that capital asset inventory? There's two sets of financial statements, just as a reminder. The way the district maintains their books and records is the modified accrual basis, and then GASB 34 requires us also to present on the accrual basis. And you might remember that financial statement looks a little bit different. It includes capital assets, net of depreciation. It includes long-term debt, whether you're funding for it out of next year's budget or budgets 5 years from now. But that's a presentation that's required under Government Accounting Standard Board pronouncements. And so we'll look at the conversion of the modified accrual basis. This is performed by the business official and her staff to the accrual basis so that the financial reporting, we can take assurance that that's correct. There's a number of long-term liabilities. There's bonds payable, there's compensated absences, there's OPEB liabilities that are captured for financial reporting purposes. You might remember this on the GASB 34 financial statement. Are those fairly stated with respect to compensated absences? If someone was paid out for time when they left the school district, was their compensated absence calculation correct? We'll look at that. To the extent that someone's bank was enhanced, is that in accordance with whatever the bargaining unit contracts are that are in place? If someone was not in the district for the day, was their time bank reduced for the day that they weren't there? So those are some of the procedures that will apply to that. OPEB liabilities under GASB 45, the district has a report that's rendered to them. It tells us, if you might remember, this unfunded actuarial accrued liability. It's a number for financial reporting purposes. You know that you pay your health insurance as you're going along every year, but this GASB pronouncement, 45, said let's take the actuarial number, if we're paying health insurance for everyone that's working for the district now and all the retirees, and we're looking at mortality tables and how long we have to pay for it, what's this big number that we would have to fund for? And we remember that it's this ridiculous number. It's huge. And we look at that number and we say, okay, is the report that's rendered, does it make sense? Does it make sense based upon the number of employees, the insurance premiums that are paid, the discount rate that's applied? Okay. Last year was the first year that the district had a proportionate share of net pension asset and liability. And you might remember that this had to do with the two retirement systems. So the teachers' retirement system overall, because they did very well as far as their investments, had an asset. And we know that there are many participants from an employer standpoint in this system. So the profession said, okay, we need to look at that asset and we need to give each of the employers who participate their proportionate share for financial reporting purposes of this asset. And this number was captured for the first time in accordance with adoption of whatever the pronouncement was that had to be adopted, and we talked about it, their share of the net pension asset. And it was a number that was just for financial reporting purposes, $50 million. Okay, we know you don't really have that number. You can't access it. It's the difference between our investments and what we would have to pay out. So we'll look at that again. That's an audit by one of the Big Four firms over the retirement system assets and their liability and their investment return. And you remember on the other side that the employees' retirement system had a shortfall. And so on this financial report that you looked at last year, you had a liability for reporting purposes of about $2 million. And we remember that you're paying your contribution for both systems based upon the boards that are setting the rates, and it's based upon the salaries that are being paid. So that has nothing to do, the way you pay has nothing to do with this financial reporting piece, but we're required to audit it based upon the audit that's performed by the Big Four audit firms of these two pension systems. We're required to look at the federal single audit compliance requirements. And you might remember I had talked a little bit about this. Over a 3-year period of time, we look at major programs and minor programs, and we have to look at those programs that at least constitute 25% of your federal expenditures because you're a low-risk auditee. And there are certain parameters whereby you can spend the money. There are certain reporting requirements. There's a certain protocol in place for the federal government as far as how you communicate, how you can spend the money, and how you monitor this. So we'll look at that again. We look at all the extra classroom activity internal controls. How does the receipt and disbursement process work? What's the backup supporting documentation for both? Does it make sense? We'll perform a walkthrough, and then we'll also take a sample of transactions to make sure that that is working appropriately. And from time to time, the Controller's Office or the State Education Department releases bulletins as to the treatment for certain things. We also look at those regulatory requirements and we apply them to the external audit process. So now, page 6, the most important part, timetable. So we'll be here on June 6th to start the work, and that's the first phase where we actually identify the key internal controls, what are the procedures, and how are we going to address getting comfortable with the fact that there's a good, sound internal control structure in place, which there has been in years past. And so we'll contact the internal auditor. We're going to review the internal audit reports, contact the internal claims auditor and review the claims audit reports, interview those district personnel in private. We're going to ask the Board of Education and the key staff of the district to give us back what's known as related party information. To the extent that you comment on something, it's my responsibility to determine whether or not it's financial statement auditable, and I will look at that transaction or that relationship and see whether or not that transaction is appropriate based upon what's taking place. Corrective action plan, I talked about that a little before, and compliance with laws and regulations. I will review all of the Board of Education minutes and then audit committee minutes, do some preliminary analytical review of the account balances. What do the revenues and expenditures look like versus your budget? What do they look like versus last year's numbers at the same time? Okay. And then we'll identify the high-risk areas, and typically that's payroll, benefits, and cash disbursements. Okay. The week of August 22nd, we're anticipating that the books and records are going to be closed. We're going to perform what's known as the more substantive audit procedures. So what's behind the numbers, okay? First part, we know the internal control structure is working or it's not working, okay? We know the information that's coming to the Board of Education is appropriate because we're tying it back into the books and records, treasurer's reports, bank reconciliations, status reports. So now, what's behind the numbers, okay? Can we build up to the payroll based on the 941 forms that are filed, okay? BOCES I talked about, okay? Transportation, okay? Can we build up to the transportation expenses? And then we have to look at, as I said before, the conversion of the books and records from the modified accrual to the full accrual. I'll come back to the Board of Education with the reports in draft in October, and we'll review them and any other communications that are required to be made to the Board of Education. And then at that point, after we have that meeting, I can release that information to the State Education Department and the Office of the State Controller, whereupon if there's a management letter, the business office will follow up with creating a corrective action plan to be filed within 90 days. And then depending upon the procedures, because the uniform guidance is new this year as far as applying procedures to the federal funds, if we can get it done on time, I'll come back with that report in October, but you might remember, because this is much more complex than the general purpose financial statement, we have until March 31st of 2017. So just like this report from the previous year took some time for us to complete the procedures, We may need that additional time post-October in order to do the same, but we will have a timely filing of the data collection form and the financial statement by the mandatory deadline of March 31st of 2017. Any questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Resolved that the Board of Education accept the federal single audit report of June 30th, 2016, prepared by Audit Proposal, LLP. Need a motion and a second.
Motion.
I'll second that. All in favor? Okay, moving over to the audit planning of 2016-17. It says 2015, I'm sorry. So we have a motion and a second. So we did 15. Yeah, I know. Okay. Good. All right, so we don't have to vote. Okay. I just want to clarify that it's June 30th, 2015, prepared by Cullen and Danowski. I need a motion in a second, it's just to clarify that error.
Motion. Second. Motion.
Okay, all in favor? All right, so we're moving out of the planning session. All in favor, I'm sorry.
Aye.
Okay, moving out of the planning session, we're moving on to, I need a motion to move out. A motion?
Motion.